their video, that would help the quality of the presentation. And then the other thing was that I believe she said this would be posted in about a week. So if you don't want to be on, it's being recorded is what I meant to say. And then it will be posted in about a week, just so you're aware. Yeah, I think those are the two big things that I want to make sure clear. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to everybody now, and Jen, remember to unmute yourself.
Yes, mute yourself.
I'll unmute you.
Okay, think you can hear me now?
Yep.
Could you hear anything I said before?
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay. So I'll get started. So this is the first time I've done a Zoom presentation. So let me putz through this here. Share. Okay. So hopefully you can see my presentation now.
Yep. Very good.
Okay. So this is more of a general presentation about banding at Riveredge Nature Center, what banding is. At first, I was going to do something that was a little more research focused, but I changed it a little bit. So so that it maybe there's parts of it that will appeal to a wider audience, hopefully, to give you an idea. So we'll start from the beginning. So this is just my intro slide with some cute birds. I didn't take these pictures. Tufted titmouse and indigo bunting. I like to use this slide for my classes because they're good, cute examples of a resident species and a neotropical migrant that both breed in Wisconsin in the summer. And at Riveredge, we catch indigo buntings pretty frequently. I personally haven't caught a tufted titmouse, though I'd love to because they're really cute. So, but I'm not actually certain through all the efforts that have happened. I'm sure there's been at least one caught at Riveredge, but I haven't actually looked. So moving on. A second. Okay, so why do we study birds? Just generally speaking, I mean, maybe I don't need to explain this to you since you're here already, but there's lots of reasons why birds are important. They provide really important ecosystem services. By ecosystem services, I mean essentially nature's services. So things that we can't reproduce on our own. So they're pollinators, they're seed distributors, they regulate pests, and they're excellent indicators of environmental health. So we all know the phrase canary in the coal mine, right? Well, we all know that was a real tactic that was used, and there's a reason for that. When birds are surviving, people are thriving. So we're tied to birds, and they are excellent indicators for us and for it, you know, if we're looking at it from an anthropomorphic standpoint, birds are good for us. What's good for birds is good for people. So if that's not enough of a reason for you, you know, of course, there's always beauty, song, flight, they're resilient, they're diverse, they migrate, and birds are highly visible. So as we all know, we see birds everywhere. That's part of the reason why I think they're so popular, is because they're easy to see. Or many of them are. There's thought to be about 10,000 species, I think, at this point that we discovered worldwide, but a new study actually suggests that this is an underestimated as far as how many species are potentially out there. There could be even more than that, 18 to 20,000. But from what we know, there's about 10,000 worldwide. So we can study birds in different ways. I like this map because it gives you an idea of the bird conservation regions that we have in North America, and this also includes Central America. It's just it's a map that divides these areas by conservation strategy. And in Wisconsin, we are in the prairie hardwood transition and boreal hardwood transition zones. In Southeast Wisconsin, we're in this prairie hardwood transition. So each of these bird conservation regions has different land management strategies and things like that that are related to birds and bird conservation. Bird conservation strategies are approached in a number of different ways. It's not necessarily just by habitat. It also can be by taxonomy or by guild. So when I say guild, in case you're not familiar with what a guild is, here's one of my favorite guilds. So a guild is just a way of grouping a species that have similar requirements and play a similar role within a community. One of my favorite ones is the avian aerial insectivores. This is something I actually spent a fair amount of time researching, the common nighthawk over here. We did some habitat preference assessments and just one field season of common nighthawk surveys. Maybe some of you were even involved in that. They were urban common nighthawk surveys where we went out during the breeding season to see what we could find as far as common nighthawks, because they actually nest on flat gravelled rooftops in urban areas, and those particular areas were not as adequately covered as other areas. So we wanted to kind of zero in and see if we could find them in these urban landscapes. And by urban, I really mean like the centers of cities and villages. So by urban, I just mean like built up areas that could potentially have those gravelled rooftops. Anyways, so I have this here because these birds are all in that avian aerial insectivore guild, and they include swift swallows, flycatchers, and nightjars. They all eat aerial insects, though at different altitudes and different times of the day potentially. But they do eat aerial insects, and interestingly, many of these species, while they're not taxonomically related, have experienced significant declines in the last decade or so, and we believe that this could be tied to their food source since that's what they share. So that's just an example of a way that we can study birds. So now moving into, we would not catch this bird. This is a secretary bird. It just looks really pretty. There's lots of different ways that we can work towards conservation. Monitoring is a pretty straightforward and effective strategy to work towards bird conservation. So by monitoring, I mean, some examples would be things like bird point counts. So just going out looking for birds and having a standardized protocol where you count birds in a certain area at a certain time. Bird banding, which I'm obviously going to talk more about. There's also telemetry methods. So we can put radio tags on birds, which I don't have experience doing, but that's another high-tech way to track bird movements. And then there's always other ongoing research methods that are more involved. So there's been a lot of there's a lot of different bird studies out there. Some of my interests are things related to climate. Sorry, I'm moving things around a little bit here. My dissertation topic is actually on indicators of phenological change at different trophic levels. So I like to look at what different groups are doing in relation to climate change. So we've seen studies that have shown several species that advanced in their timing of spring migration as far as birds go, but we also see that others have not. So it's interesting that birds might be coming from the same places in the winter or similar places, but they're not all necessarily responding to climate change at the same rate. What we see then is a potential match or mismatch with the peak abundance of their food source once they arrive on their breeding grounds. So when you think about it, if a species is arriving too late, they might miss what their peak insect food source might be once they reach their breeding grounds. So there's also been, these are just some examples of different studies. So bird banding specifically provides an opportunity to observe breeding condition of several species, which is one of the many reasons why I really like using bird banding as a tool to study birds. Okay, I have to move this. Sorry, I'm moving you guys around so I can see my screen. So it keeps, okay. Oh, sorry, the slide got a little bit mixed up when I posted it, but what it says is why catch and band birds? Why not just view them from a distance is what that says. I feel like this is an important question to address because there are some aspects, that's what that says, some aspects can be studied from afar without capturing birds. So we wouldn't be catching birds to determine things like what species are there. Although that will be determined by banding. But if our only question was, how many species, what are the species, and how many, that type of thing, that's not a reason in itself to actually catch a bird and put a band on it, right? Other things that you can observe and study without ever touching a bird would be things like song or interaction, courtship displays, migration movements at a larger scale, not an individual scale, things like nest building, all the kinds of things that you might actually be studying in something like the breeding bird atlas, stuff like that. You can, with a lot of species, you can see the sex of the bird. So you can determine if it's male or female just by looking at it in a tree. Of course, that's going to depend on the species and depend on if the males and the females look the same or different. Sex can be determined in the hand once you catch a bird for some certain species that do look the same. And I can talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Some really good bird banders can determine, or birders, I should say, bird observers can determine age of species just by looking at them in a tree, which also is going to be species dependent. It's going to be dependent on the time of the year, but at certain times of the year, that might not be a really good reason to catch a bird and look at it. So, but that's just to put those things out there. So then why would we catch and band birds? Well, there's a lot of different reasons that we can put out there. So there's a lot of different aspects that cannot be viewed from afar. One big one, and I don't have a picture of this here, shoot. There's fat accumulation that occurs on birds during migration. So when you catch a bird and look at its body, you can see in certain areas on its body that it actually puts on fat. So for example, you could catch a bird on its migration route. Maybe it stops over at Riveredge, for example, and on day one, it might have no fat on it. And the fat looks like this yellow substance that you can actually see through its transparent skin. And maybe you catch it again on day 3, and it will be completely full of these yellow spots that are actually the fatty tissue. So you can see that same bird fueled up and put on fat while it's there. So that tells you a lot about how sufficient a bird is able to refuel. It tells you a lot about the habitat quality as well, and how well they're able to refuel along their migration route. When you catch a bird, you can weigh it as well, which has several different uses in research, and using fat and weight and size together can give you a lot of information about a bird throughout its life cycle. When we catch birds, we measure things like the wing, the tail, and the tarsus length, which is a portion of its leg, that tell us things like sex can be determined depending on the species, sometimes by wing length. It also tells us a lot about size ratios. Another thing that we can look at in great detail are things like feather condition and feather age. So we can determine the overall condition of the feathers, and then we can also look at different feather generations. So birds have different, they have cycles where they molt, and the cycle that they're in will tell you how old the bird is. So you can determine if the bird was born that year, if it's a juvenile bird, or if it's older than a year old. And with some birds, you can even get to older than 3 years old. And that's really cool. And so that's really hard to see, I think, from afar. I can't see that from afar. So again, it depends on the species. But for the most part, all of those detailed feather things that tell us how old birds are need to be viewed while you have a bird in the hand. We can also tell a lot about breeding conditions. So birds will molt and get brighter feathers, so some of them will, during the breeding season, but they also develop breeding traits. So the males develop a cloacal protuberance, which is highly visible during the breeding season. And the females develop something called the brood patch, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and I have some pictures of. And these are traits that you can actually see on the birds. And they tell you, not only they tell you that the bird is ready to breed, but they also tell you if it's a male or a female, which is really cool. So for some of those birds, for example, song sparrows, that might be really hard. Maybe you can't tell if they're a male or a female. Once you get into the breeding season, they start to show you that they're males or females, which is awesome. Again, detailed information on individual birds. So when you think about it, if you're looking at a bird from afar, you might notice that you see a couple that are a certain age or a certain sex, but you don't really have a way of marking those and tracking them. So we get that detailed information that we can record and track over time. We also get to know things like longevity records. So we get to learn about the lifespan of individual birds, which tells us something about the species. And that we do by recapturing birds, which doesn't happen as often as we'd like, but it does happen fairly frequently, especially when we're doing banding at the same site over many years. So it can tell you, we've had a common yellowthroat that was 6 years old, which is really cool because it's a tiny bird that lives a long time and made it through many migrations back to its breeding site. And it's coming back to the same site. That moves to site fidelity. We learn that birds are returning to their breeding sites every time. So how do they decide this? We don't really know, but it's cool to see. It's cool to see that they do choose to come back to specific breeding sites. We can calculate a lot of different rates. So we can look at survivorship. So we can see survivorship of individuals. We can learn how productive the birds are. So how many young are produced. And then we can also look at habitat quality in a couple different ways. By morphology on birds, like I already mentioned, by how much fat they're putting on or what their feathers look like. But we can also look at the ages of different birds. Some studies have shown that older birds tend to come to higher quality habitats. So if you have more older birds at your site than younger birds, and by older, I mean, let's say you have a 2-year-old bird versus a 1-year-old bird, both might be returning, but if you have more 2-year-old birds than 1-year-old birds, it's an indicator that your habitat is higher quality. And that's because those older birds, they know where the good spots are and they get there first and they get to make use of those resources. So that's just one way of looking at it. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about what bird banding is. I already said some of this about why we bird band. And this is just, this slide shows you a couple examples. So I'll go through the steps, but here, sorry, I'm kind of looking at the wrong slide here. So this is what a bird band looks like. And we have several different sizes that are dependent on the species. And we have something called the pile guide. Oh, actually, I have it right here. This is our bird banding Bible. If you can see it, oh, I have a sticker on mine, but anyways, this is where we look everything up to determine what band size a bird will take and how we can learn about the bird, how we can determine what the age and the sex is. So this person named Pyle did a lot of research on different birds to help us understand feathers and how we and other things, other morphological traits and how they can tell us more about an individual bird. Okay. So I have Diane, you're in here a couple of times. Mary, I'm sure, I think you're in here too somewhere. So what was that? Okay. So this is just to give you an idea of what our operations generally look like. And I have a couple different pictures. We've played with a couple different setups over the years, but this is at Riveredge. This must be 2017 because I have my son with me. So he came along and he spent a lot of time in a little crib kind of hanging out. He was a very good bird bander, very cooperative. But we have tables set up with all of our gear. So we've done migration banding as well, but the focus of this is really this breeding bird banding that we use. So we follow a protocol through MAPS that's called Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. This is breeding bird banding. This picture is during the breeding season, so it's during the summer when it's hot and buggy and we have to get up super early, but it's all worth it. We can only band once in every 10-day period that's assigned to us, dependent on our region. So we band less frequently, and that's to give birds a break, basically. We don't want to be disturbing them too much while they're trying to breed and do their thing. So this just gives you an idea of what that looks like. Compared to migration, during migration, if we were to do migratory banding, we can band much more frequently. We can band every day in migration if we're able to get out there, because we're getting different birds coming through all the time, and we're not necessarily disrupting their breeding behaviors or breeding activities, I should say. Okay, so the steps to banding a bird. This is not a good example of a net. This is a, but the first step is catch a bird in a mist net. So this is what a mist net looks like when it's all tangled and we're trying to get it up. I didn't have a great picture of what the mist nets look like when they're actually up, because they're really hard to see. So it's hard to take a picture of them. So I decided I'll just include one that's tangled. Basically what it looks like is a kind of like a volleyball net, but that would reach the ground, and it has little pockets in it. So when a bird flies into the net, they fall into a pocket and they might get a little bit tangled. The idea is to check the nets as quickly as possible, as often as possible, so the birds don't get very tangled and don't have to endure a lot of stress while they're in that net. The net doesn't hurt them. It's a very fine mesh. And we have very experienced people that extract or get the birds out. So that's the next step, is we have people that carefully remove the bird from the net, and they're highly trained. And that's called extraction. So then that bird that comes out of the net is placed in a small, breathable cotton bag. We have very specific rules about what types of bags the birds can be in. They need to be able to breathe. The bags can't be washed with any harsh chemicals or anything like that. We need to make sure that we're keeping birds as safe as possible. And I should say that's our motto is birds safety is first and second. People safety is important too, but we just want to make sure that birds are safe the entire time. If we're hurting birds, it defeats our whole purpose in helping birds. So we want to be very careful, and we're very cautious. So then we want to always document the date and time, the net that we got the bird out of, things like that. Then the bird gets brought back to the table, the banding headquarter table, we'll call it, where the bird bander will start looking at the bird and determine the species first, which is really important because you really shouldn't put a band on the bird if you're not sure of the species. So that's an important step in being a bird bander, is you need to know all of your birds. You determine the band size and put a band on the bird, and then you start to examine the bird for different morphological traits, feather condition, and you start taking measurements that will help you determine things like age and sex. And then you weigh the bird, and then you carefully release the bird back into the wild, depending on what type of bird it is, if it's young, if it's obviously breeding, if it's a female that's nesting, that will determine where you release the bird. So you might walk it back to where you got it from, or you might just, if it's a male, those males can find their way back to wherever they need to go. So we usually just let them go at the table. So this just gives you some more of an idea of what that looks like. So each bird is processed and recorded. These are our recording sheets. So they're identified and then measured. So here we have a male redstart that's looking like it's molting significantly. So this would probably be towards the end of the season that this bird will be molting like this. So this just gives you an idea. We have a lot of stuff on our table. We usually like to double up on things so that we can move through birds quickly, so we're not keeping anybody waiting too long. We use color coding in our sheets to keep things straightforward. So this gives you an idea of some of the other things that we keep track of. When we can, we look at the bird's skull. So we take a little bit of water, part its feathers, and you can actually see the skull developing on young birds. So there'll be a little window in their skull, just kind of like human babies have, right? When they have that soft spot. Birds have a similar thing, and it helps you determine the age of the bird, which is really cool. So we have a rating for each of these things, and here we have skull. So if it's not complete, we'll give it a different specific number that indicates that, and also will tell you that it's a younger bird. We have our cloacal protuberance estimate, so our, I guess, rating for males, a brood patch rating for females. We'll estimate fat, we'll estimate molt and flight feather molt. So there's two different types of molt: body molt, flight feather molt, and feather wear. And then we go through all these feather generations. So birds have several different feather tracks, and we look at every single track to determine to our best of our ability when those feathers are from. So are they from last year's juvenile feathers, or are they newly replaced feathers, things like that. And we can wear these cool, I forget what this is called, cool little visors to help us see more detail on birds. Okay, so getting to some of the details, and I was actually not involved. I think this picture is from around 2008. That's my guess, because this is from, Al gave me this photo. So this is one of the earlier crews. So MAPS at Riveredge Nature Center, this monitoring avian productivity and survivorship effort, actually started in 1999. So that's over a 20-year stretch of time that we've been doing this. I say we because I feel like I'm collectively involved, even though I've only been involved since actually 2012. But the crews change. Some people are still the same. Some people are coming less frequently. Some people have passed. But it's definitely takes a large amount of effort and many different people to make this happen. So this is one of the earlier crews. I like this picture because the late Noel Cutright is in there. He's definitely was a huge part of this. When I talk about maps, I wanted to show you what I mean by maps. So this is through the Institute of Bird Populations, this MAPS effort, and I wanted to show you what we're part of. So this is the actual MAPS organization. The organized effort started in 1989. Now there's more than 1,200 MAP stations spread across nearly every state and Canadian province. And I mean, at this point, there's over more than 2.5 million bird capture records. But I have these two screenshots to show you all of these different spots here where there are similar efforts going on. It's efforts at different locations that are following the same summer breeding bird banding protocol. So the really cool thing is that we're connected to all of these sites. All of the green dots, those are currently operating stations, and all of the pink are past stations that maybe had to quit for one reason or another. MAPS in general likes to have a commitment of at least 10 years, although they always recognize that it might not be possible for people to maintain that commitment. I know that that's the intention when people start. And then here I just zoomed in on Wisconsin to show you where we are. So obviously you can see where we are, the green spot just north of Milwaukee. And then there's another kind of like our sister station close to Eau Claire. I think that's Beaver Creek. I forgot to look that up, but I think it is. And they've been operating about as long as we have, or at least, I don't think they started quite as early, but don't quote me on that. But the point is they're still going. And so that's pretty cool. So we're the two stations that are still trucking in Wisconsin. So the cool thing about this is at the end of every MAP season, we submit all of our data to this larger regional network. So researchers, scientists, people everywhere have access to our data, and we're part of a much bigger effort, which makes it all the more worthwhile. Okay, so this is one of Al's slides. So Al Shurko is, I like to call him my banding father, and that would make Andy Larson my banding grandfather. So it all began for Al, at least in 1997 with Andy Larson. They began banding regularly, and they decided that they wanted to do more and be connected to a larger research effort. So that's when they started doing MAPS in 1999. And then they started working on their skills and working and training with other volunteers and things like that. This gives you an idea of what our station looks like. So it's kind of off the beaten path from Riveredge. This shows you where our nets are located. And this is my really fancy map. it started with, let's see, so we have 10 nets. The nets 1, 2, and 3 were discontinued, and I actually wasn't part of that. Mary probably knows more about why that was. I believe it was related to inaccessibility and invasive species taking over in that area. So they were moved, I believe, in 2013 and replaced with these nets that are numbered 12, 13, and 11, which makes the numbering a little bit confusing these days, but once you know the story, it makes a little more sense. So now we have all of our nets kind of on this loop. We have 10 nets. The idea is to be able to at least walk the loop within about 15 minutes and check it in about 30 minutes. And with enough volunteers, you can definitely accomplish that. And here's again, this is probably one of, I think this is from 2018, this picture here showing some of the newer people that have come. And then some people that have been in every picture. I think Jackie has been in most of the pictures. She's one of our regular scribes, and I believe that's Mary there. So this is an example. So the picture's a little fuzzy, but this is an example of something cool that we would see. This is a grosbeak that's growing, it's probably a rose-breasted grosbeak that's growing new flight feathers. So this is something that we'd see at the end of the season when birds start molting and things start getting a little bit confusing. But we see all kinds of things, and this is something that would be really hard to view from the ground, but it would help us understand how old this bird is and what it's doing, so we can better understand how old it is. Catbirds are our most common species caught. So we have overall the highest count, and this is still true, the highest count in most years. Let's see, we had the oldest bird that was caught, and this is its band number, this long number, that's how we refer to them, was banded in 2000 and recaptured in 2002. 2004 and 2005. So it just keeps coming back and getting recaptured, and that's another one of those site fidelity examples. So catbirds will migrate south. They're neotropical migrants, but they can end up in Florida, they can end up in Central America. And then this particular catbird keeps coming back to Riveredge, which is really cool and happens to get caught. So that's pretty neat. So we have a couple of different catbird examples here. So I should say that's Joan Summer and me, and this is Al Shurko. This is one of my early training times with him. Another example of something we catch pretty frequently, and a recaptured bird would be the blue-winged warbler. We have one that was banded on July 2004 and recaptured twice in 2006 and 2007. And then another one that was captured in 2004 and recaptured in 2007 and 2008. But it's interesting, we wonder where this bird, what happened to this bird in 2005 and 2006. And it's hard to say. Maybe it didn't get captured. Maybe it went to a slightly different habitat. Maybe it was close to Riveredge, but maybe it needed to mature a little bit before it was able to come back and compete for a higher quality habitat, as I mentioned before. So as it's maturing, it might be in a better position to come back. We don't really know. That's all just that's all just speculation. Who knows? Here's a highlight that confused everyone. In 2018, we caught an Allsided Flycatcher. Flycatchers are really fun for us because a lot of flycatchers, the Pitamax flycatchers, you really can't tell apart. And so when we catch a flycatcher, I think we get a little distracted by the fact that we're going to have to go through this whole process of identifying it. So before we can actually identify a lot of flycatcher species, like I'm trying to think, the willow, alder, lesser or least flycatcher, and what else? Yellow. I'm missing one. Anyways, there's a series of questions we have to go through, a series of measurements that we have to take before we can actually identify the species. And we have a nice little sheet that helps guide us through something that Al Shurko made for us. But it's funny when we catch something pretty big, like an all-sided flycatcher, and we're a little bit stumped because it looks just like the small flycatchers, and we're not expecting it. We really don't catch these very often at all. I mean, I don't remember catching one besides in 2018. So it's really cool when we do catch one. It's much bigger than the other flycatchers. So next time we would probably be keyed into that pretty quickly, since we realize it's possible to catch an olive-sided flycatcher. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about brood patches because I'm really interested in them. And I think they're really a neat way to use information on birds. It's really always been tracked as a secondary characteristic, a way of determining females. So it's like, it's a backup. It's, you think this is a female, does it have a brood patch? Yes, then it's definitely a female for some species. Some species the males will develop a partial brood patch that looks not like a full out one. And some species, they both develop brood patches, but all that's in the pile guide. So you'll know what species develop brood patches in both sexes and what don't. For the most part, it's just females that develop these brood patches. The brood patch is linked to egg laying, and so the cool thing is if you catch a female with a brood patch and you look at that patch of skin that's exposed, you can look at the development of the patch of skin, and you can know, you can infer a lot about maybe what stage it is in nesting and egg laying, which is something that you wouldn't be able to determine without finding a nest or something like that. So it's a pretty cool way to determine what's going on phenologically with egg laying. So the patch develops in different stages. So first it starts with a loss of feathers around the abdomen. Shortly thereafter, we see blood vessels that increase in size, and then the skin becomes really thick and fluid filled, and it starts to look like a blister. We know that a few days after the young have left the nest, the swelling and vascularization begin to subside, and then the skin kind of returns to its original state. Now, this would be for a single brooded bird, would start to have this process happen more quickly than a bird that might have a couple different broods of young. So it's really cool, and the whole purpose is to be able to transfer heat to eggs. That's why they develop these brood patches, and I think it's really interesting. So here's a couple images of the different stages. These are all different birds, but it gives you an idea. Honestly, it's pretty tricky to get pictures of this sometimes because you have to blow the feathers away so that you can see the brood patch. And when it's just initially developing, it's a little bit harder to get that picture. But this bit larger image is of a catbird, and that's like what we would call a full brood patch. That bird is sitting on eggs for sure. It's all blistered looking, and that's going to transfer the most heat. These other pictures are likely on the beginning, on the either end of that picture. So either, I forgot to label them properly, depending on the time of year, if it was earlier in the season and you found a brood patch that looked like one of these three photos, then you would say, okay, it's just starting. If it's later in the season, then it's more likely that it's ending and wrapping up its breeding activities. Okay, so these were some of my research questions. I'm just going to go real briefly over some of my initial findings for brood patch research, which aren't that impressive, but I will show you what I found. Some of my questions, so if we know the timing of the onset of these brood patch development to egg laying, then we can estimate the timing of egg laying using these records taken from bird banding. And we can estimate the timing of brood patch initiation, and we can see how that's changed over time in relation to climate change. And I have 30 years here. Obviously, we can't use our map site for 30 years. We would use it for 20 years. But 20 years is pretty good. I have 30 because in phenological studies, usually in climate studies, 30 years is like the minimum amount of time that researchers like to use. So we'll just pretend like I have 30 years. And I'm looking at things like the relationship between temperature and brood patch development as a very simple way to look at it. So some of my criteria of looking at brood patches are pretty straightforward. I'm looking at passerines, I'm looking at females that develop a brood patch, I'm looking at Birds that are primarily eating insects during the breeding season, which is most of them because they need a high protein diet to feed their young. And I had to focus on birds that are commonly caught at our banding station in order to have sufficient numbers for my research. But I'd also like to look at representatives of different families and different migratory habits to compare things like residents and migrants to see if residents potentially are responding better to local temperatures than migrants, as you might expect. Here's just an example of some of the species that have kind of fleshed out as having enough data for analysis. And actually this has gotten, this is a shorter list now, but so it goes. Catbird. This is my less than impressive result that catbirds haven't, this is not a trend, but this is an example of what you can do with, this is only going, actually goes until 2013. This only goes till 2013, but this is an example of what I'm kind of trying to do to show basically just has this emergence of this brood patch trait changed over time. And for the catbird, it looks like no. So that's one result there anyways. Okay, so this is just a little bit more information about maps. I wanted to provide the links here to the Institute for Bird Populations in case anybody wanted to look at it. And I have a bird banding video. It's not from us. So I'm not going to play it right now because I think it's like 5 or 10 minutes and we don't have time for that. But it's an interesting, very well shot bird banding video if you want to take a look at that later. I just wanted to wrap this up by talking there's a lot of different threats to birds in case you weren't aware. Obviously, climate change is a big threat. They suffer from habitat loss and degradation. Pesticides can largely impact all birds, especially since they're eating insects during the breeding season. It's not just those insectivorous birds that are those regular insectivorous birds that are going to be affected. It's going to be all birds that are affected by pesticides. And then some of these things, I have this picture of the cat because I love cats. I love cats. When I was young, I grew up around barn cats. And before I knew that cats were a problem for birds, I really liked seeing outdoor cats. That was a very long time ago. And now I know that cats are one of the #1 killers of birds, and birds are so sensitive during migration. It's just really sad to see cats impacting birds in this way. So also, as much as we love to have our cats be outside and experience the outdoors, there's ways that to have them experience that a little more safely, that's safer for birds, maybe on a leash or through a screen porch, safer for birds and also safer for them because I've also heard of, cats being killed because people don't like seeing feral cats and might assume your cat's feral, which could result in it having an untimely death. I've heard horror stories about that as well. So lots of different reasons to keep cats inside. And then of course, birds are going to suffer during migration through things, collisions with human-made structures. So window collisions are a big problem with killing birds, especially during migration. I won't talk about that too much more though. And then, okay, just a list of important bird organizations to keep in mind if you'd like more information about bird conservation or anything bird related. And I believe that's the end of my slideshow. Yep, that's it. So.
Yes, so now people that are out there, we're going to have unshare the screen and then we'll go back to the gallery view. Okay. And then anybody that would like to ask questions of Jana, just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question. So hang on as Jana unshares her screen. So there's a green bar across the top of your screen, Jana. If you want to click on that, that should take you out of your PowerPoint.
Mary, I'm having a hard time getting back to my, hang on a second. I'm sorry.
No problem.
I can't find my options here to stop sharing.
It should be on a top toolbar and it says view off, and then there's a green bar next to it.
Oh, there it is. Okay, got it. Woo! Thank you.
All right. Now we can see each other. So, lots of people still out there. I'm glad to see you, and feel free to unmute yourself, and also you can, again, open up your video so we can all see each other. But questions, anybody have questions? I know I have one in particular. Jenna, do you want to tell everybody how long it takes to become a master bander and what's involved?
Oh man, okay, so becoming a master bander, that means if you're a master bander, it means that you've obtained your federal permit to band birds, which is usually either project specific or location specific or both. In my case, I have a permit to band passerines and near passerines in Wisconsin. There's really no stream, it's not clear. So there's no class that you take, there's no test that you take. What you need is 3 other master banders to vouch for you, to say that you're capable of doing this on your own and that you've acquired enough experience. And I got lucky that I was able to work this into my dissertation and spend a ton of time banding over a relatively short, fewer number of years than I think a lot of people have to do. And I also am lucky to know more than 3 master banders that I have a close relationship with. So, those are the big things. You have to find other people that are doing this, and you have to show them that you're capable, and do a lot of training. So I hope that answers the question. Then once you have those people on your side, and once you're all on the same page, you apply to USGS Bird Banding Lab for a permit. So you make like a resume, and then you have 3 letters of reference basically. And so you kind of create your own application packet that way, and you send it in and hope for the best.
Long process, I know that for sure. It takes many years and has to handle many hundreds of birds. So it's exciting that you have your permit right now. We're glad to have you. How about other people in this group? I know Diane has been banding also for a number of years with us. Maybe Diane has a question for you. And I'm curious if you know what bird actually was here and banded or recaptured the most often, one that we found that has lived for like 7 or 10 years. I think it's a resident bird.
I'm sorry, I had a really hard, were you reading something from the chat?
Well, just wondering what bird has survived here the longest.
I believe it was a common yellow throat that is the oldest on our records, which is cool because that's not a resident. That's a migratory bird, a neotropical migrant. Male common yellow throat that returned several years in a row. I believe he was captured. I'm sorry, I couldn't find his specific information, but I remember him. I remember at the time when we caught him maybe 2 years ago, he was 6 years old, and I believe he returned again. So that's pretty cool because it's a tiny warbler that likely is going to be coming all the way from maybe South Florida to Central America every year. And he really likes Riveredge.
I guess. How about you, Diane? Question? Oh, yes, not. Anybody else have a question for Jenna?
Optivisors. Diane reminded me what we use optivisors to help us see the details of the wing. Sometimes I blank out on what I'm trying to tell you.
Okay. Any idea how many banders in Wisconsin?
Oh, geez, I should know that. I don't know how many banders there are in Wisconsin currently, and I could easily find that out by asking USGS or searching their database. I think that there might be some people that have permits that maybe aren't using them. I mean, I know there's me, there's Al Shurko, Vicky Piakowski, there's Tim Vargo has a permit from the UEC, Mickey O'Connor, and then I know there's a bander at Cedar Grove Hawk Banding Station, but that's for hawks specific, or hawks and raptors. So that's 6 people that are actually like have federal master permits that I know, but that doesn't mean, I mean, there's more. I know there's another hawk bander that has a permit. I know Peter Dunn from UWM has a banding permit, but I think it's specifically for common yellowthroats and house wrens. So like I said, sometimes they're very project specific because that's what he studies. So he doesn't do general mist netting. So that's 8 that I know of, and that's just in southeastern Wisconsin. And I know that there's more, but like I said, it varies from project to project. But I could do a quick search and get back to you on that question because I'm curious too.
When you band a bird and recatch it, do you remove the original band or leave this old one on?
Oh, we leave the old one on. We always leave the old one on unless for some reason it appears to be damaged in any way or impacting the bird. And really that only happens with cardinals because cardinals have really strong beaks and every so often they will bite their bands a little bit. We've never seen anything that looks dangerous, but just in case we will remove a band if it looks like it's been altered in any way. You know, we leave the band on because actually that band number, it goes into that MAPS database that I talked about. It also goes into the USGS, database as well. So say that bird ends up somewhere else during migration and somebody else catches it, they can look that up and say, oh, cool, it came from Wisconsin. So yeah, so we leave those bands on and then that goes into our records and we're able to see how many times we've caught the bird.
So what if people find a dead bird with the band on it?
You should, if you find a dead bird with a band on it, you should write down the band number and report it to the USGS banding lab. So I could later provide that link. It's pretty straightforward. You just I think they have a form that you fill out. You just submit the number, and they do want to know those things because even though the bird's dead, we still can get valuable information like how old it is and where it ended up at the very least. You can always bring it to Riveredge to Mary, I believe, because we could even look at it in more detail. I found, for example, I did find a dead field sparrow in early spring that I believe it died. It migrated and then died probably last year during one of the cold snaps based on its body condition and everything. I found it, actually my friend Dave found it, but it wasn't very decomposed or anything. But the cool thing, and it's really sad that it died. It turned out it was about 4 years old. Very sad that it died, but also really cool that we found it. And I still have it. I have the preserved bird so that we can look at its feathers. I could probably take it to Riveredge because they have the permit for that. But I can look at its feathers in more detail. We can use it for studies, and we can report that we found it to the USGS lab as well.
If you get a report back from them, all the information you can get on a particular bird that was banded, where it was banded, how old it is, and so on. So worthwhile sending in that information to get that history on the bird.
Yeah, definitely. Even if you don't feel like doing the work, you can always write down the band number and information, and you can send it to me or something like that. I'd be happy to help with it.
Great. Any other questions for Jenna? So, as we're closing here today, I want to remind people if they're interested in observing a banding operation, we have a birdathon, bandathon as part of a fundraiser for the Bird Club on the 15th of May. So join us here and you'll have a chance to watch the bird banders band all kinds of, well, we hope, all kinds of different spring migrants. We'll probably be down near the river outpost building on the west end of the property where we get some really nice migrants coming through. So 15th of May for Birdathon, Bandathon, if you'd like to see this process in action. Also want to remind people of the next key topics, which is the last Tuesday of the month That Tuesday is the 27th of April, and our speaker will be Sumner Matson, and he will be speaking on a book that he's written about Wisconsin naturalists, probably the top 10 of the list, and he's writing a second book. Andy Larson will be part of the next one. So do tune in for the next 2 topics on the 27th of April. Sumner is also well known all over the state for his research on piping plovers. So we'll have a chance to hear him actually for the Bird Club in May too. So join us for both 2 topics on the 27th and then for the Bird Club meeting on the first Tuesday of May. So lots of birding activities coming up with all the spring action and nice weather coming. So I want to thank everybody, including Jenna, for an excellent program. Really enjoyed it and learned a lot. Even though I've been part of that program for years, I'm always envious at these recaptures and the new history that goes with these birds that keep coming back to Riveredge. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next month, or at least at the end of the month, for the next 10 topics. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.